Okay, everybody, let's go to puzzle time, which is our last example for today. It's very similar to the dogs example that we did, so what I'm going to do is give you guys space to try some of these things on your own. The first thing I want you to notice is that the data itself is in what we would call our wide format or our short format. Each one of these measurements is the same type of measurement. It's the amount of time that the participant spent trying to solve an unsolvable puzzle. But we've broken it up column-wise by two different populations, males and females. Right? So here's the idea. We're hoping to quantify this notion of perseverance, and so researchers gave participants an impossible puzzle to solve and recorded how long they attempted to solve the puzzle before giving up. Now we've broken up these scores into males and females, essentially trying to see if there's a gender difference to how much time they'll spend working with a puzzle. So at our first pause point, what I want you to do is create a visualization to explore differences between the two samples. Okay? So pause the video and give that a shot. All right, so hopefully, as we've done in the previous examples, you decided to use a box plot, highlight all of your data. We can go into our statistics chart, insert a box plot. For those of you that want to be a little fancier, you can say comparing puzzle times between men and women. And you could click into this chart design ribbon, go to add chart element. You could add a legend on the bottom so that you can see which is which. But remember, generally speaking, the one to the left is the data to the left. So in this case, we have males and females, and it looks like on the sample level, females tend to spend a little bit longer, although there are some outliers down here. And certainly by looking at the X's, which are the means in this case, the mean time for women is longer than the mean time for men. So this is kind of suggesting that women have more perseverance than men when it comes to solving these impossible puzzles. But let's actually look at the numbers. So in this case, we want to create a pivot table, and we want to summarize those pivot table, the mean times men versus women, the standard deviation men versus women, and the sample size men versus women. So again, remember the way that you break out this pivot table depends on the formatting. So as a quick review, you can always go back to our A&P test. This is an example when you're in a long format, how you build that pivot table. And then the dogs is an example when you're in the wide format, how to build the pivot table. All right, so what I would do first is self-test. Try to create the pivot table on your own. Give yourself a couple of minutes to play around with this, and if you figure it out, great. If you don't, go back to those other two worksheets, sneak a peek at the answer, and then generate your table. All right, so go ahead, pause the video, and give that a shot. All right, so the start of this process is always the same. We highlight our data, we do insert pivot table. Oops, go down one. Once we have our pivot table, I take a look at the actual variables. I have males and females. And looking at what kind of data is recorded in each one of those variables, I can see that I'm dealing with quantitative variables for both. So I know that quantitative variables pretty much only go into the values field. I don't want to keep track of the values by column, so this is going to have each one of our summaries going across a column. I want to do this by rows so that it doesn't bleed into example 3 over here. And then I'm just going to change the summary type. So I'll start out with maybe just the averages for males versus females. So the average time for males was 4.8 minutes, and the average time for females was 5.9, or 4.9, 5.9. I also want standard deviation and sample sizes, so remember you just have to drag extra copies of those variables into the values field and then change the summary type. So rather than sum of males, I'm going to do stdev, and rather than sum of males 2, I'm going to do count to get my sample size. Same idea with the sum of females, stdev for standard deviation first, and count for sum of females. So what I can see is that in both cases, and again, if you want to, you can kind of highlight this Males were in blue, females were in orange, so we can highlight our table to kind of match our box plot. So our average for the females versus males we discussed. The standard deviation for males was a 1.14 versus a 1.5-ish, and we notice that the sample sizes are equal between the two. All right, so in our last case, we're going to consider problem 3. We want to use a significance level of 2% to test the claim that the puzzle time for women is less than or equal to the puzzle time for men. So again, give yourself a self-testing opportunity here. Pause the video, see if you can write out your null and alternative hypotheses, the type of test, compute the p-value, and write out a nice full conclusion. So give yourself a good 5 minutes to go through this material, 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll check back in and go over it together. All right, so let's say, let's let men equal population 1 and women equal our population 2. So according to our claim, we're testing the claim that the puzzle time for women is less than or equal to the puzzle time for men. All right, so in other words, the puzzle time for men should be greater than or equal to the puzzle time for women, the way that I've set this up. So if men go first, women are population 2, this would be the equivalent null hypothesis for this statement. The puzzle time for women is smaller than the puzzle time for men. So our alternative hypothesis is as follows. Mu1 is strictly less than mu2. And this is a left-tailed test, but more importantly, it's one-tailed. And what this means is essentially, if we insert a little comment, in the t.test command, we're going to have tails equaling 2. So that's why it's important to determine the type of, or sorry, not tails equaling 2, tails equaling 1. This is why it's important to determine the type of test before moving forward. All right. So to get our p-value, we use the t.test command. We need array 1, so this would be our array for men. So this is A2 out to A28. And since we have the same sample size, B2 out to B28, we can double check, is the array of information for our females. Tails, which is our next argument, is set to 1. And type, remember, we always set to 2. So this t.test command will give us the p-value for this particular hypothesis test. We have a very small p-value, and this specifically is less than our alpha value, which is 0.02. Our significance level. And so with a p-value below our significance level, we reject our null hypothesis. So in our final conclusion, our sample data has provided sufficient evidence to conclude that the mean puzzle time for men at the population level is in fact less than the mean puzzle time for women. Now, what does this mean in terms of the study? This is suggesting, I should say this suggests, that women have more perseverance for this type of activity. Great work, everybody. Today, our hypothesis testing process has been extended to consider different types of claims. And fundamentally, the process is always the same. You write out the claim that you're testing, the null hypothesis, you consider what the alternative is, and you do some sort of computation to get a p-value. And based on whether the p-value is above or below your significance level, you come to a conclusion as to whether you should reject the null hypothesis or keep it. Now, we've seen this in one sample test where we actually compute our p-values by hand using probability distributions. And now we've seen a shorter cut example where we're comparing means between two populations, where we get that p-value using the t.test command. All right, so these are the hypothesis tests that I'd like you to be aware of for our final exam. Hopefully, again, the process is familiar and it's just sort of a matter of kind of knowing when to use what. So this is something you'll definitely want to practice in the weeks coming forward, and certainly come and ask questions if you have them. The last quick thing I want to point out is that we've already started our review of the Unit 1 information, right? We've talked about creating comparative box plots. We've started to reintroduce and work with our pivot tables. So think of this as all helping you practice and review for that final exam. We'll consider these small forms of review as we consider our last topic, correlation and linear regression.